I'm a 19-year-old female attending a community college in Oregon. It's kind of known around town for having a lot of strange characters. Back in February, I was partnered with a guy named Brian in our chemistry lab. He was significantly older than the rest of the students in class, probably in his early 40s. He was very tall, around 6'4", and just a big guy in general. I was friendly even though he creeped me out a bit. If he realized we had an interest in common, he would not stop talking about it. Every day when lab ended, I'd have lunch in the cafeteria and he would join me, uninvited, continuing on about anything we might have in common. Once I tried to get rid of him by telling him I had to go to the bathroom, but he just waited outside for me the whole time. I wasn't too uncomfortable, but it was clear that he had trouble with some social concepts. I started to run into him everywhere. Literally anywhere I tried to go on campus, he'd show up, even on days that he didn't have class. I gave him my number at the beginning of the term so he could send me any notes that I missed, but he started to text me non-stop. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt at this point and assume he just needed a friend. But soon, things got worse. He started to get flirty with me, calling me beautiful, asking if I had a boyfriend, touching me unnecessarily, and giving me shoulder rubs. He joked that I looked 15 all the time, and once even said, "You're young enough to be my hot daughter." After this point, he really stepped up the creepy factor. He'd always talk about his abnormally large dick and ask if I was a virgin. Whenever I got upset, he'd say he was just kidding or call me a prude. Around this time, he also started showing up at work, even though I never told him about my job. The first time, he tried to pretend he didn't know I worked there, and every time after, he'd say he was stopping by because he was in the area or because he needed to buy something. One day, when I was on the computer at my school's library, he showed up at the computer across from mine. The library only allows 1 hour of free computer time a day, and mine was about to run out, so Brian offered for me to use his. I appreciated the gesture, so I decided to take him up on the offer. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to check his browser history after he left. After a bit of snooping, I found his Tumblr page. He had a couple hundred posts total. Most of his reblogs were not safe for work posts of really young-looking girls, but that wasn't the most disturbing thing. He had written tons of posts about me. His early posts were nonsensical, angry rants, but the first day of our chemistry lab together, he wrote a detailed account of our first interaction. He described me as a vulnerable young girl who was too old for his liking, but then went on to say that I looked young enough. My stomach churned reading this. The post about me continued, describing more of our interactions and talking about how he'd imagined sleeping with me. He even talked about stalking my social media accounts and finding out where I worked from Facebook. I immediately went home and called the police, but they said there wasn't anything that they could do unless he physically put me in danger. I couldn't sleep for a fucking week after this. I notified my professor, and luckily he switched my lab day. I changed my normal schedule around and spent the least amount of time on campus as possible. I bumped into Brian a few times, but every time I'd just tell him I had to go and hurry away. About a month later, as my roommate was unlocking the door late at night, a man grabbed her from behind. Luckily, she's a badass, muscly chick and has taken self-defense classes, so she stomped on his foot, kicked him in the groin, and ran like hell. I was inside while this was happening because I had called in sick to work that day, so I'm glad she was the one to encounter him. She called the police, and they found a backpack with a rope, a knife, tape, and Rohypnol right by our door. I immediately freaked out and told the cops about Brian, pulling up his Tumblr page to show them. Sure enough, there was a new post about how I'd been avoiding him, and he thought that I found a new boyfriend. So He was going to confront me that night to try and convince me that I truly loved him. It was probably the most bone-chilling thing I have ever fucking read. Of course, they ended up arresting him. They found child pornography on his computer, so he is going to prison. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't called in sick to work that day, or if he had grabbed me instead. One night, a while before I met my husband, I was at home drinking a bit and looking for love on the internet. I ended up posting a personal ad on Craigslist describing exactly what I was looking for in a mate. I didn't mention anything about looking for sex. I was just really hoping for a potential drinking buddy that might lead to something more. A guy responded pretty quickly with a proposition of sex for pay. I responded that I would never do anything like that, explaining that the offer was insulting to me and pathetic for him. He called me all kinds of names and said that he was blocking me. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? Wrong. He somehow figured out my phone number and emailed it to me to let me know he found it. My ad was under a dummy email and I had never even mentioned my name, but he started texting me and threatening to kill me, my parents, and my son. I still can't figure out how he even knew I had a son. He continued texting me while I ran errands, saying things like what aisle of the store I was in. I didn't respond to a single message. I went right to my mom's house after shopping and noticed that her rose bushes were missing all their petals. She said she had no idea what happened to them. I spent a few hours with her before going back to my place. My front yard and driveway were covered in rose petals, the same petals that were missing from my mom's house. He texted me a few minutes later asking if I liked his gift. I didn't respond. Thankfully, I didn't hear anything else from him after this. I'll preface this by saying it might be quite long. I'm 24 now, and this sequence of events started when I was 18 and went on for 2 years. I don't talk about this very often, partially because the story is so long, but also because it was such a frightening and stressful time for me. I'm from the south of England, and at 18 I moved to London to go to university and study. For my first year, I planned to live in halls, the English equivalent of dorms, I suppose, but at the last minute opted to move in with 2 of my friends that were also moving to London. We found a 4-bedroom house to rent at a reasonable price and found a 4th housemate through Gumtree. I knew Emily and Jack from secondary school, and Matthias was a student from Austria who had moved to London to study abroad. Things were going good, and we did much of the usual first-year student stuff. Takeaways, nights out, drinking, and not getting nearly enough sleep. One night, we stayed in to enjoy a pizza and a fair amount of beer. We were chatting about the fact that we were all single, and Jack thought it would be fun if we all joined OkCupid and each went on a date. We all agreed that it could be fun, so we made our accounts and started looking for dates. I started talking to a few guys on OkCupid, and 2 really stuck out. I thought it'd be nice to at least go out for a drink with either one, so I decided that whoever asked me first would get the date. Quite quickly, one of them asked, and I agreed. The date was alright enough, a couple of drinks in a pub. It wasn't exactly eye-opening though, and I decided to not go out on any more dates with him. I was still talking to the other OkCupid guy, Alex. There was something about him that I liked. While he never ended up asking me out for a drink or anything, we did end up swapping numbers and started messaging each other almost daily. We had a lot in common and would talk about anything, complaining about uni work, what we had for lunch, films we'd watched, etc. Over time, we found out quite a lot about each other. He was nice looking too, as I saw from the pictures on his profile, curly brown hair and nice eyes. I really liked him and hoped he'd make the first move and ask me out. Since I was young and naive at the time, I hadn't considered just asking him myself. After maybe a month or so, however, I started to notice some little red flags. He'd drop little things that he knew about me that I had never told him. For example, he knew the university I studied at and the names of some friends I hadn't mentioned. When I asked how he knew these things, he'd just brush it off, saying my university was easy to work out from other things I'd said, or that I really had brought up these people in previous conversations. I was sure I hadn't, but he sounded so confident that I doubted myself. On top of that, he had started to say things like, "If only I could meet you." I'd ask him why not, since he lived in London too, but he would just say it's complicated or that he was in a weird situation at the moment. His messages gradually became more intrusive. He started asking if I was seeing anyone or if I had slept with anyone since starting university. He even asked if I had slept with either of the guys I lived with. He talked about some girls he knew and how they were all slags and how he hoped I wasn't like them because that would make things bad. After each stream of intrusive questions, he'd always apologize and say he was just joking, but of course this was always after he had gotten all of his questions answered. I tried to cool off our relationship a little since the things he was saying started sounding more and more off. The more I distanced myself from him, the more ways he would find to contact me. First, he found my Facebook and sent me messages that simply had smiley faces. I knew for sure that I had never given him my surname. I had also started an evening job in a call center, and I was shocked to open my work email one day and find an email from someone named Alex Guess Who. Again, the message was simply a smiley face. He started to come off as more sinister. It seemed like he was doing these things with the intentions of making me nervous, to have power over me or something. I ended up replying to him and asking him how he found out where I worked and my full name. Of course, the response I got was simply a smiley face. The evening I got the email on my work account, I went home and told Jack about everything with Alex. We decided to look him up on the Facebook account he had messaged me from, but the profile was blank and looked like it had just been set up to specifically message me. Jack then asked to see the text messages we'd exchanged and advised that I blocked him. I did. I hoped it would stop there, but of course it didn't. Bit by bit, Alex showed me that he knew every little thing about my life and that he could easily fuck it up. First, he found a forum I posted on at the time and commented on every thread with my full name and phone number, and then wrote that he had nude pictures of me and pictures of me taking drugs, and he would send them to anyone who asked. It was all lies, obviously, but he quickly got blocked from the forum. Next, he started calling my work and asking to talk to me, telling my manager who answered that there was a family emergency. Whenever I got to the phone feeling worried, I would just hear a man laugh on the other end and then hang up. He also started emailing me from various different accounts, calling me names, insulting me, and threatening to come to my house. I started getting phone calls from withheld numbers to my mobile phone. All the weird, heavy breathing shit that you hear in horror movies. He started threatening me too, emailing me links to Wikipedia articles about known serial killers, saying fucked up things like, "This will be you if you ever date someone else." The most disconcerting thing about his messages was that there was always an LOL or a haha, or the old faithful smiley face. There was something about it that was just jarring. One morning I came downstairs and saw that a folded piece of A4 paper had been posted through the letterbox. When I unfolded it, it simply had a smiley face in a massive font. This would have almost been funny and pathetic if it weren't for the fact that it was obviously hand-delivered, meaning this guy not only knew where I lived, but he had been at my front door at some point during the night. I was so scared at this point. He knew everything about me, and I was getting incredibly jumpy. I hated being in the house by myself. Any little noise made me nervous. There was nowhere I could go to escape him. He'd made himself known, and it was like he could show up at any given moment. My housemates were great throughout the whole experience and really helped me deal with things just by being there for me and doing their best to make me less worried, even though they were quite worried themselves. After I had been dealing with Alex for about 10 months, Jack and I started getting close. We'd known each other since we were 11, and he had always been a brilliant friend that was more than happy to listen to me go on and on about how scared I was. He was just great and made me feel protected. Around this time, Alex seemed to have lost interest slightly. The messages were still coming, but they were less frequent. I wondered if he'd finally given up on his weird game he was playing with me, but I soon found out he hadn't. Alex continued stalking me for another year. I'll try to write up the second part of this tomorrow. It gets even weirder. This story happened to me when I was 15 years old. I was a super lonely kid. My home life was in shambles. Mom was cheating on Dad and told me about it, and I just started at a new high school the year prior where I didn't know anyone. Creating art quickly became my biggest coping mechanism. To this day, I still love to draw. I discovered the website DeviantArt around this time and started submitting my drawings every day. Through this site, I made some friends of all ages. Some very talented people were giving me positive feedback on my work, and it really inspired me. In my deep depression, I felt like DeviantArt was a safe haven of like-minded people who appreciated one another. For the first time in a long time, I belonged somewhere. I spent countless hours talking to some regulars on the site. Even now, 10 years later, a few of them are still in my life, and I cherish their friendship. But this story is about someone very different from them. DeviantArt also allows writers to submit their stories in poetry. One day, I was on the front page and a poem caught my eye. It was more of an angry rant than a poem, full of weird, twisted imagery and anti-Christian subtext. Sounds stupid, I know, but it was quite well written and funny, at least to my 15-year-old self. Being a very angry, depressed high schooler, I was drawn in and decided to check this artist out. Not only was he a prolific writer with maybe 100 poems and stories on his site, but this man was a very talented visual artist as well. He created amazing illustrations of strange creatures. Some of them were a little sexual, like naked women, but most of them were humorous or gross. His name was Tom. The combination of Tom's writing and visual art skills intrigued me. Even though he was 30 years old, I decided to send him a private message. We bonded quickly and soon began to talk on AIM. I came straight home after school to talk to him every day, and we ended up chatting for 5 hours most nights. In hindsight, I realized that my family probably wondered what I was doing, but they never said anything. I guess isolating myself in my room wasn't abnormal at this point. I was so grateful for my new artistic friend. I could be as dark and confident as I wanted to be when we talked. I unloaded a lot of my pain onto him, and he told me about his troubles too. Tom even started to write poetry about me. Happy poetry. It made me feel very special because I had softened this angry dude's heart with my friendship. Or so I thought. After maybe 3 weeks of talking, Tom asked me for my phone number because he wanted to hear my voice. I was extremely uncomfortable with this and reluctant, but he insisted and gave me his number to call. Fearing I would lose a friend who is so important to me, I finally gave in. I should mention that I'm 23 now, and I'm still a shy person, but at 15, I was painfully awkward and detested phone calls. My heart was racing, and I was shaky and sweaty as the phone rang. Tom picked up. "Hello?" My voice sounded shaky. Tom spoke. I knew how old he was, but I was relieved to hear that he sounded younger. It made me feel less uncomfortable, but I was still a bit weirded out. I had no idea what to talk about, and for some reason I felt like crying. Tom and I spoke for a bit. He laughed at the awkward things I said, so I guess the conversation went alright. Honestly, I can't even remember what we talked about. All I remember is that he barely spoke at all. We finally got off the phone and talked online more. He said how happy he was to hear my voice. I was still upset, but glad that I didn't disappoint him. I hoped he wouldn't ask me to call him again because it was such a stressful experience, but I had poured so much of my time talking to this man that I was willing to be uncomfortable to preserve our friendship. My self-esteem was non-existent back then. The next day, Tom wanted me to call again. On the phone, I could hear him breathing heavily. He was masturbating. I didn't know what to do, so I talked about my day at school, some random thoughts, and he stayed silent apart from the breathing. When I was mid-sentence, he hung up on me. When I asked him what happened over AIM, he told me I wasn't talking about anything sexy, so he left. I apologized and felt a total sense of failure. I panicked and the conversation quickly turned sexual. I told him that I was a virgin, and in reality, I hadn't even had a real first kiss. Tom was overjoyed by this. Now, I really had his attention. By the spring, our relationship had progressed. We'd have inappropriate conversations, and I would even send him pictures of myself in my underwear when he asked. I had no idea what I was doing, but felt like I had to obey him or he wouldn't be my friend. He started to write poetry about taking a girl's virginity. To his fans on DeviantArt, they were just fictional poems about a fictional girl, but I knew they were really about me. For a shy and lonely kid, this was both thrilling and sickening. My 16th birthday was coming up in June. Tom and I constantly talked about how badly we wanted to see each other. In the back of my mind, I really missed the days before everything got sexual. I told him there was no way I could ever fly to Florida where he lived. Tom insisted on seeing me before my 16th birthday. Eventually, we picked a date. He found a hotel near my family's house that was relatively affordable and even bought tickets to fly out. The plan was that I would skip school that day and spend the day with him so he could take my virginity. I can't remember if he was even going to stay more than one day, to be honest. I came home from school one day and my mom was extremely solemn. She told me she knew about Tom. She said I had left myself signed in on AIM, but I think she actually got my password to see what I was up to. I began to cry and defended Tom at first, but then I admitted that I was terrified of him. I was so ashamed that my mom saw our sexual conversations, but she just hugged me and told me, "He won't be coming, I promise." She had emailed Tom, which really fucking spooked him. Tom began to yell at me and blow up my phone. He told me he spent $500 that he couldn't get back on the plane tickets. I never picked up any of his calls. He wrote me tons of emails in all caps. I still have a few of them saved. He wrote angry, violent poetry on DeviantArt about how I had betrayed him. I was devastated and hated myself. On the day Tom was supposed to come visit, I stayed at my best friend's house, which was miles away in a totally different community. My mother gave out photos of Tom in our apartment building to make sure nobody let him in. I was totally paranoid that he would pop up for a while after that, but he never did. In fact, I didn't hear from him at all. He completely stopped submitting any art or poetry. Over a month went by, and Tom was still missing in action. My family and I went to Canada for a music festival. Life was slowly going back to normal, and my guilt was fading. While we were in our hotel room, my phone suddenly rang. It was Tom. I tried to pick up, but since we were in Canada and I had an American service provider, I wasn't able to receive the call. I was panicked, so my memories are a bit foggy, but I know he sent me some messages. A few days later, we took a train back to the US, and as soon as we crossed the border, I sent him a text. I apologized for what happened and explained I was in Canada, but that I had missed him and hoped he could forgive me. Tom told me the reason he was gone for so long. He said that on the day he was supposed to come see me, he got very drunk and tried to kill himself. He stabbed himself all over, including his stomach, left hand, and legs. Feeling last-minute regret, he called his mom, and she called the police. He told me that his whole apartment was considered a biohazard from all the blood, and after he recovered, he spent time in the psych ward. Tom had mutilated himself so badly that the hospital had to amputate his leg, and he lost 2 fingers. He told me it was all my fault. I was utterly speechless and my blood ran ice cold. I refused to believe him, but lo and behold, he uploaded some pictures of himself on deviantart. His leg was amputated above the knee and he was missing fingers. I had seen previous photos of him and, yep, this was my friend Tom, all right. It's hard to explain how I feel about this situation. I feel very sad for Tom, but I also understand that this wasn't my fault. I was a very lonely child and desperate for a friend. Tom was a schizophrenic man and a pedophile, as was later revealed by his explicit poetry about little girls. Eventually, he was banned from DeviantArt, and I never talked to him again after age 16. A few years ago, I looked him up and found his profile on a different site. Admittedly, I was Googling him to see if he was still alive. In his profile picture, he was next to a young woman with his hand over her mouth. It looked like he found someone who was willing to visit him after all. I never even met him. I didn't know his name or face. I was blissfully unaware of his very existence. I'll never know why or when it started. I'm glad for that, I guess. I moved into my very small apartment in February last year. My landlord, Olivia, was a sweet older woman who would cook too much and bring me much appreciated leftovers. She was great to me, even after I told her my problem. I'm antisocial, but she didn't mind renting to a reclusive young girl who reminded her of her daughter. Every few weeks, she would knock on my door and then leave, letting me know she was leaving something for me. I loved that. Not even my family would cook so well. The next morning, I would wash and leave her empty containers outside my door, and within an hour or so, she would take them back again. My other neighbors seemed fine, but I never talked or visited with them. I work from home, so anytime I was ever forced to go out, I rushed out and back into my apartment to avoid uncomfortable situations. I loved living alone. It was everything I hoped for. I could just breathe. By April, though, I started noticing things were not right. Stuff was moving or plain disappearing. I was convinced it was just anxiety caused by my new medication and the move. Another side effect of the medication that it would make me so drowsy. Since I hated seeing the doctor, I just dealt with it. I started taking naps during the day and eventually stopped caring about the strange state of things in my apartment, until one incident doubled my paranoia. Olivia brought me some sort of Greek salad and dressing for lunch one day, and I enjoyed it with my good friend Netflix. I fell asleep in the middle of Portlandia and woke up that evening at 5 p.m. as per usual. What was not usual was that the bedding on the opposite side of me was disturbed. I only sleep on the right side. Always. Even worse, it felt warm. My first thought is that I must have rolled around a lot, but I knew it was too odd to just dismiss. I got up and searched my apartment, gripping my phone with 911 typed in. Nothing else was disturbed. Everything was exactly like it should be. I let it go. For the next few weeks, everything was normal, pardon the occasional misplaced shoe or drawn-back shower curtain. I thought about telling someone, my parents, maybe Olivia, but if it's not life or death, I'm not reaching out to anyone. I wasn't scared, I was nervous. Maybe a little stubborn, but I stayed. I'm not letting some stupid anxiety ruin my lovely, lonely world. May came, and it was getting worse. My panties, toothbrush, hell, even my food was being misplaced. Every time I woke up, there was this strange odor in the air. I finally realized this wouldn't go away by ignoring it. I called my mom and begged to come stay with her for a few days. When I got home, I told them everything. Saying it out loud solidified any creepy suspicions. That weekend, my dad went back to my apartment, and what was found was true horror. Written all over the walls was, "Come back, baby, please." He ran out and called the police. There was no one living in my apartment, but someone definitely had access besides me. After some investigation, the police discovered that Henry, Olivia's son, was in some sort of projected relationship with me. They showed me his confession on tape. He admitted to coming into my apartment every night and day with his mother's extra key. He claimed that we were in love and that he had my permission to come in. He drugged the food his mother left out for me, which was the real reason for my drowsiness. Whenever I fell asleep from the drugged food, he would come in and watch me sleep, touch my hair, or kiss my shoulder. The leftovers I had in the fridge were tested and confirmed to be drugged. I was absolutely horrified and disgusted. A man I never knew existed collected my drain hair, clothes, and trash, and practically lived in my apartment for 4 months.